So for the many folks who are joining us as we've been here chatting, my name is Ted Landsmark. I'm director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, which is part of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. And you've joined the open classroom where we've been discussing the impacts that design has on communities and community development. We've been doing this semester with my colleague Anne-Marie Lubenow from the Rudy Bruner Foundation. And with that as a brief introduction, I will turn the screen over to Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Ted. As Ted mentioned, my name is Anne-Marie Lubenow, and I'm the director of the Rudy Bruner Award for Urban Excellence, the Bruner Foundation, and we've been delighted to partner with Northeastern University to offer the Inspiring Design Series. The Rudy Bruner Award is a national urban design award that recognizes transformative places that contribute to the economic, environmental, and social vitality of American cities. And this semester, we're tapping into our national network of people engaged in urban design and development, along with our 88 Rudy Bruner Award medalists, to explore the role of design in shaping cities. In tonight's session, we're going to focus on the role of writers and writing and helping people understand the impact of design. And I am thrilled to be joined by three colleagues who, through their writing, publications, and events, have engaged the public and provoked conversation about urban development in Boston, Houston, and Philadelphia. We'll consider how they and organizations like the Rice Design Alliance in Houston help to foster critical civic dialogue about design and its impact on so many aspects of urban life. And we'll learn about how one of them, Rice Design Alliance, informed the creation of Buffalo Bayou Park, a resilient public green space along Houston's primary bayou and a 2019 Rudy Bruner Award Silver Medalist. We are continuing to partner with the Boston Society of Architects and Boston Society of Landscape Architects to offer continuing education credits. Please use the appropriate link in the chat box to submit your information. Tonight's panelists include Renee Loth, who's an opinion columnist for the Boston Globe, where she has held several high-profile positions, including editor of the editorial page. She also served as the editor of Architecture Boston, the quarterly ideas journal of the Boston Society of Architects. She's an adjunct lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and was a 2011 fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Raj Mankad is the op-ed editor at the Houston Chronicle. He believes in making room at the table for voices from across the political spectrum and all of our diversity. Raj has edited and written for publications that specialize in economics, philosophy, literature, architecture, science, and health, including the Rice Design Alliance publications site. And Inga Saffron is the architecture critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she writes about architecture, design, and planning. She recently published Becoming Philadelphia, How an Old American City Made Itself New Again, a collection of her writing that captures the city's evolution over the past 2 decades. Inga is the recipient of the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Criticism and was a 2012 Loeb Fellow, along with me, at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Tonight, as on other evenings, we will begin with a series of brief presentations to set the stage for a moderated conversation between the panelists before turning to audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions, and we look forward, as always, to an engaging conversation. Now I'll turn this over to Renee.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. And just for the record, I want to say that I have learned more about architecture and urban design from Anne-Marie Lubenow in the 10 years I have known her than if I had gotten a full scholarship to graduate school. So I want to thank you for that. And it has been 10 years. As Anne-Marie pointed out, in addition to being editor of the editorial page of the Boston Globe for many years and still a columnist for the Globe, I was editor for 7 years of Architecture Boston Magazine, which is the quarterly ideas publication of the Boston Society of Architects. So if Ben, if you would just show that first. So not every cover of the magazine was quite as cheeky as this one, but I wanted to show it to illustrate a point about urban design and dialogue around that. That, by the way, is a Jell-O mold of the Harrods department store in London, if you're wondering. Every issue of the magazine had a theme, and in this issue, we waded right into the contentious question of taste, of beauty. I mean, what is beauty and who decides? It was such a heavy topic that we decided that, a little bit of wit in the presentation of the cover was something we wanted to try to help our readers enter this, complicated philosophical question. But, to this question of what is beauty or what is design excellence and who decides, I mean, for generations, architecture critics thought that they were the sole arbiters of taste. They had all the answers. They knew what was good and what wasn't. And they were the, like the last people standing between the public and the heartbreak of bad taste. That's enough, Ben. You can put that down now. Luckily for us, the role of the architecture critic has evolved. And it's no longer sort of like the oracle from on high with the one great idea, but architecture criticism is more almost like social criticism now, where architecture and design is a lens through which we can see our broader culture. So not just questions of beauty, but questions of equity or climate change or housing or mobility or, physical and mental health are all woven into architecture criticism today. And tonight we are really lucky to have two brilliant writers who totally exemplify that change. I just think that those of us who are writers and who love cities have an important role to play in sort of helping the public care about urban design. I mean, giving them a sense of their built environment and how it affects them. I think that the demise of the full-time architecture critic in many major newspapers, including my beloved Boston Globe, has kind of weakened a little bit of the civic glue that this criticism, that these roles sort of provide. And, that sort of guides the readers to understand their built world and gives them the confidence to demand that the built world serves them and not the other way around, if you know what I mean. But there are other ways to advocate for design in communities besides the traditional architecture critic. And so I want to talk a little bit about something we did on the editorial page of the Boston Globe. When I was editor there, we made a real priority a public discussion about the design of the 17-acre linear park that replaced the infamous Big Dig in Boston. Ben, you can show that other image now. This is coming soon. This is the central artery of Boston. This is the before picture. You can see that there was a highway that cut right down the center of the city and cut it off from the waterfront. And then the next picture will show you the after image, which is the 17-acre, 1 mile, a little bit more than a mile linear park that replaced that highway. Now, those two pictures made it look really easy, but it was a long and really difficult process. We created a logo on the editorial page called Beyond the Big Dig, and we ran, dozens, probably scores of editorials about this. We weighed in on their budget, on the governance, and particularly on the design. Questions around, should this be just passive open space, or should it have a lot of activity? Should there be any permanent structures built on the Greenway, or should they be sort of more temporary and tactical kind of installations? All of these kinds of questions we addressed on the editorial page. And we held a series of public forums at the historic Faneuil Hall. This was 2001, beginning of the 2000s. And so they were attended by then US Senator Ted Kennedy and then Mayor Tom Menino. And the idea was to try to nudge the process forward because it was terribly mired in politics and inertia. The Greenway is 17 years old now. And in the last year before the pandemic hit in 2019, they clocked 1.6 million unique visitors. And so, I mean, physical visitors. And so, you know, it's a terrific success. I just think that this kind of civic dialogue, this kind of advocacy, you know, that exists for the public and not for the powerful, it takes a lot of time, and it takes sustained attention. And, you know, it can take years. It can take, in fact, 50 years, which is where I now turn the baton over to Raj Mankad, who is going to tell us about a 50-year process in Houston that reimagined these you know, sort of polluted series of culverts into a beautiful public space. And then we're going to be hearing from Inga Saffron, who will be talking about a also career-long process, which was about getting Philadelphia to reimagine itself. So Raj, it's all yours.
All right, thanks for having me. It's really an honor to present. Let me get my, let's see, I want to do full screen mode, okay. Well, I'm going to be talking to you about Buffalo Bayou in a historical context. My main argument is that the settlement of the Houston region was fundamentally shaped by enslavement and the legacies of slavery. And then, so in the 1970s, when a progressive group of architects and activists sought to reimagine the bayous, it was part of a larger struggle to desegregate the city. Buffalo Bayou Park and Bayou Greenways 2020, which I'll talk about as well, are a culmination of that 50 years of work. But I'll also argue that the approach taken to get those projects done is insufficient, that it does not address the inequalities that remain, and the inequality that was revealed by Hurricane Harvey and other disasters. And what we need is a full-on commitment to regional urban design that's funded and enforced by the government, which is an important point when you're in Texas. All right, so I'm going to move through a bunch of history really quickly, sort of an absurd amount of history. But Houston is at the intersection of several different ecosystems. So you have the piney woods coming from the east, the prairies coming from the west, and then you have the coastal wetlands on the Gulf Coast. And the landscape isn't as flat as it seems. It was shaped by the changing course of these winding bayous, by the wind, and even by the footprints of mammoths. And so we have these features called Curry Pothole Pimple Mound complexes, which I love to say. Archaeologists working at Memorial Park near Buffalo Bayou have found evidence of managed burns by the Karankawa people. And today, Juan Mancias and other members of the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe talk about the continuity of their culture with the people who lived in this region. So the historian Andrew Tourget, in his book Seeds of Empire, tells the story of how the Spanish presence in Texas nearly collapsed in the early 1800s under pressure from Native American tribes. Stephen Austin proposed to the Spanish and then Mexican governments to bring families and enslaved people from the United States to settle Texas, grow cotton, and then provide a bulwark against Native people. The more enslaved people that these US settlers brought with them, the more land they were granted. However, the newly independent Mexico had at various points included the abolition of slavery in their working constitution. And that led to, or contributed to, tensions. The Battle of San Jacinto, in which the Texian army defeated the Mexican army and captured General Santa Anna, was fought on the banks of Buffalo Bayou. So this is what we're talking about over here. This map shows, Texas when it was part of Mexico and the state of Coahuila. And the battle site and the site where Santa Ana was captured is now surrounded by refineries and storage tanks and port facilities. The new Texan nation enshrined slavery in its constitution, continued slavery as a state, and then as part of the Confederacy until Juneteenth, 1865. Okay, and after the Civil War, Houston became the place where the railroads meet the sea. This is a photo of Buffalo Bayou, Allen's Landing, where the city was founded. It's also now the site of the Buffalo Bayou Partnership. You can see, train tracks and a train, and you can see this incredible convergence of modes. Houston was where cotton grown on plantations and was shipped out. There was a sophisticated merchant and banking class, and a series of street grids were overlaid on the landscape without regard to floodplains. Excluded from higher ground were freedmen's towns and immigrant enclaves. They were often established in lower lying areas along the banks that flooded. Okay, so now we're at 1912. Arthur C. Comey, a Boston landscape architect and student of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., produced a plan for the city of Houston that envisioned the bayous as linear parks, that layered recreation, mobility, flood management, and wildlife habitat. You can see that range of uses in these sections. And in this map, you can see the way that multiple bayous sort of form this system. The plan was paid for by commissioners out of their own pockets, which is a theme I want to return to. Houston was still deeply segregated. So this park infrastructure was not an exception. So this park over here on the right, bottom right, in the Woodland Heights neighborhood wasn't, if you were a Black person or a person of color, there were only certain days you were allowed to visit. The implementation of the Comey plan was partial. It lost momentum after the Great Depression hit, and then there was a massive flood in 1935, which sort of changed people's idea of what should happen to the bayous. By the end of World War II, the Houston area, in partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers, embarked on a period of grand engineering. This is a photo of the Barker and Addicks reservoirs. The diagram is this three-sided earthen kind of levee that holds back water, and that experienced a terrible failure during Hurricane Harvey. Many segments of the bayou were converted into concrete-lined trapezoidal ditches. But there was also a variety of conditions. So on the left, you can see Buffalo Bayou in this sort of this very wealthy area, and it was left with this fluvial morphology. But it was still downstream from these dams, so it was, it's still managed. I just love this painting by the Malawian artist Masa Lamu, who spent a couple of years in Houston, and this painting is called Smoked Tilapia, and I just think he really captured the ruin and also the strange beauty of these concrete landscapes, and there's this blood oil spilling out from it. All right, so now I've gotten us to the 1970s, fast forward us to where architecture criticism enters. In 1972, David Crane was hired as the dean of the Rice School of Architecture. He was a child of missionaries, Harvard trained. He came to Houston from the University of Pennsylvania, and he was appalled by the state of design discourse and the urban planning in Houston. and he decided to tackle the problem from multiple angles. His collaborators at Rice, this is what I'm showing. This image is an article that I wrote and published in Cite, and this diagram on the left, this cartoon depicts the complicated regime of institutions and people that shape, the landscape in Houston, especially the bayous. But David Crane, this new dean, his vision was that there should be a critical research and practice arm at Rice. That was called the Rice Center, and it was complemented by this civic consciousness raising component, and that became the Rice Design Alliance. And it involved a lot of people from the University of Houston as well. So the Rice Design Alliance was this public forum, and it was based on a model from Boston College. And they had brought together elected officials, technocrats, designers, community leaders. And the very first activity of the Rice Design Alliance was a civic forum on the future of the bayous. This would have been about 1973, and they kept at it for several years. And these forums, the findings of them were published as books. Or booklets, and eventually the Rice Design Alliance started publishing a magazine, 1982, called Cite, and that's where I worked. And then Cite eventually formed these deep ties with the Houston Chronicle, which is where I am now. So there's this, even though the Chronicle didn't have an architecture critic, that always had this problem that cities newly have now, and so there was this sort of effort to compensate for the lack of design discourse with Cite. OPEC Drennan, the first RDA president, told me that at one of these Bayou forums, that a Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon showed up and came with a green jacket. And Drennan says that the people from Harvard were terrified. This KKK member had a few things to say. It was kind of incoherent. Drennan emphasized that the RDA succeeded in putting together alliances of civic-minded people, including good old boys who came in cowboy boots and the aforementioned Harvard architects. The research and practice experiment, the Rice Center, it failed. It ended up closing, but its vice president and director of research development, Bob Urey, went on to start Central Houston, which uses management district tax increment reinvestment zone monies to carry out planning and improvements in the downtown area. And Central Houston ended up incubating Buffalo Bayou Partnership, which has long been led by Ann Olson. So what I want to emphasize here is that this moment in the early 70s coincided with a push to integrate Houston schools, elect a new slate of candidates at the school board. So it was at a particular moment in history, and there was a crossover in the leadership between these different groups. So even though if you looked at the sections from the Bayou, reimagining the Bayou plans from the 70s, and you compared it to the 1912 sections from Comey, they looked very similar, but the vision was in fact different, right? These were supposed to be integrated spaces that would connect and link communities that had been divided by these grand engineering projects of highways and trapezoidal bayous. In 1985, the Rice Design Alliance partnered with Central Houston for to hold the sesquicentennial design competition to design a park along Buffalo Bayou on the north side of downtown. It was the first design competition for a civic project in the city's history and drew 119 contestants from around the country. 3 young and relatively unknown Houston architects won. One of them was named Guy Hagstedt, and he went on to play a central role with the Buffalo Bayou Partnership and creating the Buffalo Bayou Park. In 2002, the Buffalo Bayou Partnership began a planning effort, a master plan led by Jane Thompson, another Boston connection. It was a 20-year master plan that many folks, including writers for Site, found sort of audacious and outrageous at the time because it didn't include any funding mechanism, right? It's, paid for by a nonprofit. It wasn't, included in, it wasn't a government-led, the planning and zoning in Houston is so weak. It would be an opportunistic type of planning that sought to get parts built whenever the chance arose, whenever some bit of money showed up, and these parts would eventually add up to a greater whole. And it would be nearly 20 years later that an agreement between the nonprofit, with backing from substantial private donations, along with the flood control district and the city, with funding from one of these obscure tax authorities, led to the full funding of the master plan and its implementation on the western side of Buffalo Bayou. It was designed by SWA Group and won Rudy Bruner Award in 2019. In 2012, the Bayou Greenways project gained momentum. So this is on so Buffalo Bayou Park is really kind of a small stretch of a few miles. And this Bayou Greenways is 150 miles of hike and bike trails. So it's massive in scale. So, we talked about it as, this rebirth of this plan from 1912. But that Comey plan was actually just in this inner close-in area. So this Bayou Greenways was really at another scale and really exciting. And the public backed the $100 million bond with a lopsided, vote. And there wasn't a whole lot of sort of race baiting, sort of dog whistle politics that I recall from that vote. And so it sort of, in its quiet way, was a major victory over, a racist design politics of the past, where the bayou infrastructures were used to cut off communities. So I would say it's fair to say that we've come a long way from that angry KKK member at the 1970s Rice Design Alliance Civic Forum. But Hurricane Harvey really underscored how the ongoing inequalities become that much more intense and catastrophic when disaster hits. So this is a photo of Mesa Road. It became sort of an iconic image for Harvey. This street is on the northeast side of Houston in an area that's largely Black and brown and low income. And that street now, of course, is dry, and you could drive up and down and maybe not really tell that this happened. But the people in those neighborhoods, many of them are still recovering. They still might have mold. They still might have houses that haven't been repaired. And for a whole range of reasons, like FEMA equations for infrastructure projects and repair, the recovery from Harvey has been unequal. It's made the inequalities worse. So, making Houston resilient, it can't be achieved through opportunistic planning that led to Buffalo Bayou Park. It's just not enough. The scope of the problem is much worse than that. What we need are better land use restrictions and codes. We need to make room for the river. We need coordinated investments and infrastructure, large-scale buyouts, and investment in affordable housing. And all has to be done with a regional urban design vision that adds up and that addresses, you know, this past, instead of heaping more injustice on this legacies of slavery. So I guess just, you know, this photo, you can see these intersecting systems, and they're treated as separate systems. They're planned separately, and they're not, you know, they're not dealt with together. I'll end with this photo. I think her name's Doris. She's a member of the Harvey Forgotten Survivors Caucus. This group of folks is banding together, and they're giving each other sort of mutual aid and support, but they're also advocating for themselves at every level of government, city, the state, federal levels. They're tireless, and you know, when I'm feeling hopeless, I just think about these people who keep going. All right, thank you. And I think next we're hearing from Inga.
Inga, you're on.
Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating, Raj. Thank you. I'm going to give a little shorter presentation, a kind of a condensed account of my time writing about architecture in Philadelphia, and how I've used that for advocacy. And I started a little over 20 years ago in 1999. And I guess you could say that I'm a legacy critic at a legacy newspaper in a legacy city. Philadelphia is an old city with a traditional grid, with buildings, you know, that are cheek by jowl with each other, and made of stone and brick. And I have a few slides I should show, but I forgot, this is like the cardinal mistake, I forgot to include a slide of my book, which just came out. So I'm just gonna hold it up here. And this book, Becoming Philadelphia, How an Old American City Made Itself Anew Again, is really just a selection of columns I wrote over the last 20 years. And there's a longish opening essay, which talks about, you know, just the profound transformation of the last 20 years. And my tenure happens to coincide with this amazing period. So this is the condensed version of that essay. So when I started in 1999, which is really not that long ago, blink of an eye, Philadelphia was in very bad shape. It was losing population still, it was losing jobs. It had just avoided bankruptcy. And many people, many leaders in the city were convinced that if Philadelphia were to survive, it would have to become more like the suburbs. And so a lot of the planning and development projects of that time really had a strong suburban mindset. All the proposals had crazy amounts of parking, a lot of it surface parking. The buildings turned their facades inwards. The city wanted to build all these new downtown parking garages, standalone parking garages, because they believed that suburbanites and tourists wouldn't come into the city for entertainment or dining unless they could park right next to their destination. And to achieve this vision meant tearing down a lot of the rich textured fabric that really make Philadelphia such a wonderful and authentic city. And unlike many, many other cities, including Boston, we did not tear everything down in the 60s. Everything was, you know, pretty much everything was still there. So it wasn't my intention when I became the Inquirer's architecture critic to become the parking critic. But that is essentially what I was in my early years. I found myself writing these columns, these screeds against parking garages and auto-centric designs, because I would argue that I felt Philadelphia's salvation lay in this amazing patrimony of buildings. It's rich, largely intact blocks. It's humanely scaled streets. It's wonderful row houses and townhouses. It's just incredibly walkable. And in the beginning, in those early years, I was really swimming against the tide. And people really said, "You are crazy," and beggars can't be choosers, and this is what Philadelphia has to do. But I kept writing these columns, because I am, greatly influenced by people like Jane Jacobs and William White and others. And over time, amazing thing happened was that more and more people came to embrace the same way of thinking. And there began to be this pushback against, this idea that Philadelphia had to become more suburban to survive. And that pushback, or that change in mindset, it actually included some developers. For whatever reason, some of it was financial. They realized it was a lot cheaper to build an apartment building without parking than with parking. And they actually became more urbanist in their approach. And here's where I want to start with my slides, Ben, if I may. Thank you. So one project that seems to encapsulate this whole debate over whether the city should suburbanize or urbanize was how to develop this very forlorn piece of waterfront called Penn's Landing. It's on the Delaware riverfront. The site, which you could see next to that boat, had been created in the 70s from landfill, and it was created right before the bicentennial. And Philadelphia had these grand visions for this site. They thought there would be like a city of towers built overnight on this site. But it turned out you can see the highway, I-95, and then another road called Delaware Avenue or Columbus Boulevard. There's 1,200 feet of highway separating the old colonial city from the waterfront of its birth. And it's very inaccessible, very, kind of both physically and psychologically. And it's not that big, as it turns out, just 13 acres. And so there were a series of developers who tried to build on it, and just one failure after another. And by the time I got there, the mayor had become convinced that it should be a shopping mall there with like a carousel on the roof, and they were going to build a tram to Camden, which is across the river. But it was going to be a shopping mall surrounded by a parking lot. And needless to say, this was incredibly problematic. There was the obvious problem of this sort of blank wall building on this pretty part of the waterfront. But the problems of access still remained. It was difficult to get to by car, by foot, by bicycle. And the proposal did nothing to repair this gash created when I-95 was run through the city, cutting off the historic colonial city, as I said, from the river. So I must have written, dozens of columns about Penn's Landing. I did a 5-part series, and it generated a lot of conversation because Philadelphians really felt they owned the waterfront, and they they had a lot of ideas about how it should be developed. And gradually there was a backlash against the shopping mall, and out of that grew a citizen-led planning effort where different neighborhood groups, organized some big meetings, and there were conversations, mediated conversations. And then a sort of professional group that came out of the Penn Design School called Penn Praxis. They got a local foundation to bankroll a more formal effort to master plan this site and to think about the whole waterfront, which was a big step because for too long we had only thought about this one 13-acre site and we didn't see it in a larger context. So Penn practices a sort of early master plan, then evolved into a more formal master plan, and maybe most importantly, the reorganization of the agency that had been overseeing waterfront development. Can I have the next slide, please? Ben? Thank you. The great thing about this planning process, as I said, was it just was a complete reassessment of the problem. It wasn't the 13-acre site; it was the whole waterfront. There was no point in just replacing, you know, the failed shopping mall with some other mega developer. And so instead, the new waterfront agency adopted, you know, a more incremental, fine-grained, step-by-step approach. Actually, it sounds a little bit like Buffalo Bayou, and they began thinking about a series of pier parks along the waterfront and improving the bicycle and pedestrian connections. They built bike lanes, and they began to think about how they could connect the old city with the river to get around this problem of the big gash of 95. We didn't have the money for a big dig, unfortunately. I did write a couple of columns saying we should totally cap I-95, but every time I mentioned that, someone would say Boston, the big dig, and billions and billions of dollars. So we couldn't do that, unfortunately, but they came up with the idea of this cap, which is actually now in the beginning stages of construction. And because there is a sharp grade change from the old city down to the river, the cap kind of gently slopes down from what we call Front Street, which is the last street in the old city, down toward the riverfront. And I think, you know, I hope it will provide an easy connection, from a walkable connection from downtown to the river, kind of seamless connection, and as well as a good event space for the city. It'll be like the city's living room, a central park. And one of the reasons also that this cap and this park were seen as such an important move is because they saw it as laying the foundations for attracting development and building, you know, what they originally envisioned in the 70s, which is, you know, a grid of towers. And so just like we have, Philadelphia is famous for having four colonial era squares that are very elegant and are surrounded by you know, high-rise apartment buildings. They envision this as being sort of a fifth square. And over time, that gelled, and then the waterfront agency put out a request for proposals, and they got a bunch of responses. Can I have the next slide? So it got very fraught near the end because the owners of the Philadelphia 76ers wanted to get their hands on this piece of land, and they wanted to build a new arena for the 76ers. And I have to say there was a total freak out in the city because this was exactly what we didn't want to use the waterfront for. And up until the last minute when they announced who the developer would be, people were sure that the waterfront agency was going to cave and violate the master plan, but they held true to it. Can I have the next slide, please? And so the winner was a New York company called the Durst Organization, and they indeed did propose a series of towers that will be built over time on their own cap. And they have streets between the buildings, and they have ground floor retail, all those kind of urban things that we like. There is parking, but they're putting it under the cap, so very little, no garages on the surface. Obviously, it's not a completely organic urban neighborhood, but I think it's about as close as you can get in these very difficult conditions. So just to give you an idea of how momentous it was to have this kind of proposal after all these decades of really anti-urban proposals, and other things. I'll just read you the lead, or the first graph of the column I wrote after this project was announced. And I wrote, it's too soon to say whether Philadelphia can overcome the curse of Penn's Landing and create a real neighborhood on that glorified sandbar at the foot of Market Street. But after almost 50 years of trying, the city's waterfront manager has finally succeeded in picking a developer for the Delaware River site without anyone being indicted or sent to jail. So that represented a kind of maturing for Philadelphia. I think there's another slide or two showing the streets. Yeah, I'm sorry this is so blurry, but you can see there are pedestrian walkways. And next slide, please. And there will be, streets for cars, and let's hope there's some retail left when this pandemic is over, and that'll be on the ground floor. So you're very much like Buffalo Bayou. This is a 50-year evolution, and for me, it represents more than 15 years of reporting. And I think it's important to understand that this sort of advocacy is a long game, and you don't change minds overnight or without losing a few battles. I think this Durst proposal probably would never have happened if Philadelphia hadn't undergone this extraordinary comeback over the last decade. Until the pandemic, the city had been on a tear, gaining population for more than 10 years straight, gaining jobs. We had a huge financial surplus going into the pandemic. Obviously, that's changed everything. Although strangely, housing construction has just continued apace throughout the pandemic. It feels like a boom town still. I don't understand it. Maybe it's low interest rates and the generous local tax incentives. Maybe there is a real demand for housing in Philadelphia. But what I can say is the script is really flipped from 20 years ago. When we used to demolish our wonderful blocks of row houses and our great old buildings to create suburban style developments, now we are demolishing our wonderful row houses and walkable blocks to urbanize, to build taller, denser buildings. And there's a lot of good things to be said in favor of density, and it's certainly better than the alternative. Yet at the same time, I do worry that Philadelphia risks losing its special character and charm, and most of all, its livability to developers' short-term goals. And so, in 20 years, we have gone from tearing things down because nobody wanted to be here to everyone wanting to be here. And I still find myself advocating for many of the same things that I was advocating for in 1999. And I guess that'll go on for a while. So thank you.
So I'd like to raise an initial question. We have a number of questions coming in from our participants, but I'd like to raise an initial question, and that is maybe in two parts. As the role of the design critic has been diminished in many of our public newspapers and the like, who's filling that role at this moment? And then secondly, I'd like you to talk about how you perceive your roles as writers. And by that, what I'm really asking is, each of you comes into this from a position of real expertise. You've studied, you've worked on this, you've looked at projects and buildings, both old and new, around the world. You're highly knowledgeable and you're advocating for a position. But you're not a community meeting. So the views that you're expressing are not necessarily always the views that a community might express to an authority in a community meeting. And so what is your role? Are you a community organizer? Are you a critic of bad design? Are you an advocate for good design? What role do you play as a writer?
Thank you. I think all of us, because we're columnists, have this wonderful perch of being able to express opinions. But I think it's important to make a distinction, and many readers don't hear this exactly, between being an advocate and being an activist. I don't consider myself an activist. I do consider myself an advocate for human scale design, basically, in the city of Boston. I mean, the great thing about the three of us is that we all have deep roots in our communities. We've been there, for many, many years. We've seen a lot of changes. We can feel, even in a parochial town like Boston, I've been here 50 years. It almost makes me legitimate. So I think that helps a lot, that we have that, I don't know, the bona fides of having been here for the long haul. But I would just think that it's important to say the difference between advocacy and activism. We cover the activists. I spend time going to community meetings, or at least used to, I'm in touch with them and I talk to them, but I'm not, that activist myself.
Maybe I can offer sort of a little perspective on how the architecture critic, the job has changed, and the landscape that exists right now. When I started in 1999, I mean, there weren't that many architecture critics on newspapers. There were more than there are today, but it's always been like a small group. I always joke that when we have our conventions, we just need one room somewhere, because we're never more than maybe a dozen of us, and the decline of that sort of legacy newspaper critic has kind of mirrored the decline of local news. Unfortunately, there sadly fewer and fewer local newspapers. They have smaller staffs, less money to spend. Arts coverage in general has really been just virtually eliminated on most newspapers. So that's the very sad part of the story. But the upside is that it's a multipolar world now, and there are so many more sites where people can discuss these issues. Obviously, zillions of Facebook chats, there's Twitter, but there's also many very fine websites from what used to be called City Lab, is now Bloomberg Cities. Curbed has some very good criticism. In Philadelphia, we have quite a number of urbanist websites. We have one called Plan Philly, another one called Hidden City. There are all these YIMBY websites in Philadelphia and elsewhere. It's a very multipolar world, and it's all enriching the conversation. One thing I would say is that, someone like me, I came up in the journalistic tradition, and even though I'm a critic, it doesn't just like come out of my head. I do a lot of reporting and verification, and it's the one thing I still have that I can offer the world, is that this is vetted information and my opinions are based on facts and knowledge, which is not always the case on Facebook or some other places. So that is a big change, but we are very, very lucky to have all these places where these conversations can take place.
I'll just add really quickly that, in Houston, since there really wasn't design criticism in the paper, the architecture community decided to invest in it, create their own magazine, hire writers, and, nothing replaces a newspaper-based architecture critic, but, they made an investment themselves, and it sort of fills the gap.
We have a couple of interesting overlapping questions. What would you say is the impact that you've had on issues of social and racial justice? Historically, one of the questioners asks, isn't it the case that most architecture and planning critics have been older, well-educated, almost exclusively white writers? Would the criticism be or feel any different? And is it any different now? If the nature of the critic themselves were to change? And then in a very specific way, we have a question for Philadelphia, but I think it applies to all of the projects, and that is, how have the changing fortunes of the city and what you've written about impacted on low-income communities and African-American communities?
Yeah, I mean, it's super wide. It's when I'm at when I'm at a museum opening or whatever, a new building, and there are people coming in from all over the country, whatever, I'm usually the only person who's not white, and that's terrible. I don't know what to do about it. It's dismaying. And then I'd say these projects, the cruel thing about them is that they can exacerbate, hypergentrification. So, I think the responsibility of the architecture critic and the architecture community is to, be projected and optimistic, and not only say no. I think that's the difference, I think, between critics and architecture critics and some activists, right? Like we can't just say no to something that is a terrible idea. We have a responsibility to imagine, a different kind of future. But those are both excellent questions.
I guess I would say it is true. The profession is incredibly white, and it was incredibly male as well. And even though the great architecture critics of the past was a woman, Etta Louise Huxtable. When I started, I don't know if there were any women architecture critics on newspapers, but the world has really changed a lot in the last couple decades, and in cities like Philadelphia that are really struggling to survive, the story was very much about development and how can we keep the center intact, and less about, at least this is true in Philadelphia, less about neighborhoods. But now it's very much about neighborhoods, and I write much more about issues of equity and gentrification and public space and how it's used and who uses it. And I think if there is another generation of architecture critics, which I really fervently hope there will be, I think that generation will be, I hope, more diverse and represent more views, because they're just going to see the world in a different way that people like me just can't possibly see that world, and they're going to write about different stories.
And I'm very curious, how would you describe the difference between being a critic of a project that has been completed, which the critics at the Times, New York Times often did, and a project that is more speculative, that is in the early design phase, or might even be an open piece of land, as was the case with the Big Dig. How do you go about sorting through what might be considered good and better and best in that regard, keeping in mind both what current city residents and workers may want and looking at the future needs of the city?
Do you want me to talk about that, or Renee to talk about the Big Dig?
Well, I think that I'm not, an architecture critic really, but I think the difference is that, the traditional architecture critic of the, 70s and prior saw those finished buildings as their primary focus. They saw them as sculptures, as pieces of art, and, designed by a lone genius artist. It's very different than the process of covering or writing about the process of developing open space or an area, a new neighborhood, like the Seaport is a terrible example of how not to do that. And, it's a very different process. And I think, much more democratized, much more at the ground level, you can do a much better job and have much more influence, I think, ultimately, when you're writing about what you're describing, the second thing you described, which is more of an open plan, open process. We haven't got an actual, tall structure to talk about, but a process. It's very different. And I think more democratic.
And I'm also curious as to what value set drives your thinking. And by that, I mean, we often look at development, and critics have historically often looked at development from the point of view of aesthetics, sometimes from the point of view of utility, and often from the point of view of what the development does to drive economic development. What are the kinds of standards you use now, particularly as more and more people talk about the importance of engaging diverse communities in shaping the cities within which we live?
I think if you look back to the time of Ada Louise Huxtable, the 60s, there was really like a style war going on, and there was a lot of criticism was about how faithfully design should adhere to the modernist style. And she wrote a famous column about Edward Durrell Stone's Huntington Gallery on Columbus Circle, because it violated that. And then the postmodernists began like violating certain things. So there was a lot of focus on the finished building, because people were in these style wars, and people were you deviating from the official style, and how, and was that acceptable? And there was of course a lot of ideology embedded in that. Now, well, I don't want to get into a long discussion about architecture, but we're way more ecumenical in our approach to style, and we're lucky. I hate to sound cynical. We're lucky if we get just a well-designed, well-crafted building. I mean, it's except for museums and universities, it's so developer-driven and it's so money-driven. By money, I mean Wall Street. Everything is a financial formula. So I think there are other frameworks that are used now by critics to evaluate buildings. Of course, urbanism is one framework. for seeing them. Do they create an environment that's humane and walkable and open to everybody? Equity and gentrification is another framework. Will this park or improvement set off gentrification, and what kind of measures are being implemented to mitigate that gentrification? That's a big issue in Philadelphia. Or I'm lucky to write a pure design column, because I so often get drawn into policy, because it's the policy that determines the ultimate built form. And it's hard to write about architecture, because you really have to write about all the policies and money and politics that ultimately are expressed through the built form. And every once in a while someone builds a wonderful building and you get to celebrate that.
I would just say, Ted talked about values, and I think that our approach to the built world has changed so much now that if a building isn't environmentally sound, if it doesn't address climate change, if it's not accessible to a broad array of people in diverse communities, if it's not healthy building, then you can't call it a beautiful building anymore. And I think that our very ideas about beauty and about what is a good building or not have to be completely imbued now with these values around the environment, climate change, accessibility, and all of that. I think it's really changed a lot. What do you think, Raj?
Oh, well, so I'm an op-ed editor, and then I was a magazine editor. So I'm always trying to basically curate a meaningful debate, right? Or meaningful, thoughtful conversation between multiple viewpoints. So, there's sort of a more, we don't have to be reductive about it. But, with limited page budgets and time, we end up with just plain old less criticism. And I often have a battle with other editors, like just to convince them that something that's just about form, or at least now that I'm at the Chronicle, at the Houston Chronicle, it's a battle to convince them that it's important and interesting, and that readers will get it. It's not obscure and technical. And then, when I was at the architecture magazine, I sort of had the opposite battle, where I, trying to push people to think about all these other questions that Renee and Inga just raised. But yeah, we don't have to be productive. And I think one role, with the threatened brutalist buildings, we can help point out when things, we have a role in helping people understand different kinds of beauty than maybe what they learned at home or in their suburban neighborhood. I don't think we should be shy about helping people understand, like, form and proportion and materiality, intimacy, scale. We can still help people develop their own vocabularies. And if we manage to do it well, we can get that in along with the policy analysis. But yeah, you can't always have it all.
I've had a lot of fun writing a short column, which was called Good Eye for a while, which focused on an existing building, usually an old and unloved existing building. And I would write about why it was good or bad or, interesting. And the piece would only be like 600 words with a bunch of photos. One time I did a series on early 20th century gas stations. I did some really hated buildings. And it was just as Raj said, it was to educate readers and make them look at these buildings. And I think there is a place for something like that. And people actually loved it. They loved the history part. They loved the story part, and they loved, that they got to learn something in a very accessible way.
So in effect, you are educators. As we're winding down, let me ask a couple of overlapping questions, which each of you can answer as you see fit. Apart from each other, who do you read now for critique of the environment? And in a related way, what do you consider to be a good building or public space? What determines the quality from your perspective?
I think what Alexandra Lang is doing is really exciting, just working on different platforms and sort of refusing a traditional critic's role, sort of jumping into different social media, her own newsletter. What I look for is, what I'm really interested in is intimacy that isn't driven by commercial exchange. I think, the pandemic has accelerated this sort of deracination of storefronts, right? Of traditional urbanism. And in Houston, we kind of we didn't have that anyways. So how do you get a built environment where people feel a sense of belonging and connection to one another, and that's also not organized around buying stuff? That's what I'm looking for.
Inga or Renee?
I'll just say something I'm worried about, which is that, all three of these pieces we talked about, the Penn's Landing, the Buffalo Bayou, and the Greenway were all successful, I think, because they knitted back together communities that had been torn apart either by a highway-centric or racist design ideology. And then the cities responded, and it was big successes, and people started loving their cities again. We had turned our backs to our waterfronts, and then we turned them front again. People started loving the cities and wanting to live there and so on. All of these office high rises. I read this really dispiriting piece in the New York Times earlier this week about how the hollowing out of the downtown in New York City, and it's true in Boston too, and I suspect in these other cities, because of the pandemic and everybody working from home now, is not really expected to come back, at least, not for a while. And, there's all these ripple effects, throughout the rest of the cities because of that. And they call it the economy, and little stores and restaurants and so on, theater, everything. And I'm just wondering from my colleagues what you think is the role of the writer here or the journalist here, short of like overt boosterism, in trying to make sure our cities survive this post-pandemic period.
And let me just add to that. I saw some data just last week that one of our large skyscrapers, downtown skyscrapers, which normally would have about 2,500 people coming and going from it every day, now has 80 to 100 people coming and going. And that has devastating effects on the local economy, lunch, and a range of other things. There's been a lot of discussion about how COVID has changed the way we work, our perceptions of open space, the way we play, social distancing, all of that. And the question I have is, particularly given that we're looking at a major infrastructure funding bill that will put a lot of money into capital improvements, what do you think the real long-term lasting effects of COVID will be on the built environment?
Well, just to expand on that story that Renee mentioned about the hollowing out of downtowns, really our cities, all our cities, even like newer cities like Houston, have been based for more than a century on this downtown business center where, people of all types came together to work, to shop, to eat, to be entertained. And, I really worry about what happens when that center is degraded. And, we have no center in our politics, really. What happens when we have no center in our physical world, a place where we could all people of all kinds can come together. So I think it is important to talk about what can replace the traditional central business district. And I've been using the phrase bedroom city, that we are, I do believe people will still want to live in cities, but I think work is going to be more dispersed and decentralized. So how can we find places where we can come together?
Others? No? Okay.
No, it was also my question. I don't know. I mean, I think we need to play a role, writers, all people of influence in our cities, but I don't know exactly how to help people regain confidence, which is what it's really a psychological thing largely, as well as a medical issue. So.
Well, with that note, I will turn the screen back over to Anne Marie. And I thank you all for the work that you've done over the years to help bring a higher level of quality and accountability to those who are involved in changing the built environment. So my thanks to you, and Anne Marie, you're on.
Thank you. And thank you, Renee, Inga, and Raj. And I think also, one of the goals of this session was to not just highlight the role of writers in writing, but to reiterate one of the themes that's been core to this series is the importance of public engagement. So I think as we heard tonight, the role, the writing that Renee and Inga and Raj have done, also played a role in just sparking conversation and creating some, civic dialogue about the future. And that's hopefully something that we can all participate in as we move ahead. Just to remind our audience, the recording of this session will be accessible both the Myra, Kraft, and the Rudy Bruner Award website. The latter will include links to information and resources, including the Buffalo Bayou Park case study. Raj provided a really wonderful prequel to what's captured in our case study, so it will make it all the richer to read it over. Just you've got a little bit more time to submit your information for AIA and ASLA continuing education credits. Next week, we're going to focus on the role of arts in fostering creativity and inclusivity in our cities. And our panelists will include arts leaders and developers from Boston, San Francisco, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. And we'll consider lessons learned from the continuing evolution of our 1997 Rudy Bruner Award Gold Medalist, Yerba Buena Gardens in San Francisco. Also, I just wanted to add a footnote. I mentioned the Loeb Fellowship that both Inga and I were fortunate to be a part of, and that is a program offered through the Harvard Graduate School designed for people who are engaged, mid-career professionals engaged in the work of cities. So I encourage you to check that out. And I hope we will see all of you next week. Thank you.